Hello, and welcome to Questions and Concerns. I am the westward facing Wallace, and I am joined by the bright Binkus. This week, as we do each week, we ask a question that may not have an answer and raise a concern that may only pertain to us. So, Binkus, this week you have a question for me?
Yes. How many people do you think are just performing the day to day of their lives rather than actually living?
Now, I thought this was, again, a rather nebulous question, but rather interesting. And so, what I did was I looked at performance artists first and foremost. I looked at the extreme kind of side of performance art. And then I also looked at something called technological determinism, which I will explain as we go along. But first, I just want to read this little quote from a woman who is far smarter, or at least far more articulate than me. Um, Her name is Gillian Flynn, and it goes like this. For several years, I had been bored. Not a whining, restless child's boredom, although I was not above that, but a dense, blanketing malaise. It seemed to me that there was nothing new to be discovered ever again. Our society was utterly ruinously derivative, although the word derivative as a criticism is in itself derivative. We were the first human beings who would never see anything for the first time. We stare at the wonders of the world dull-eyed, underwhelmed. Mona Lisa, the pyramids, the Empire State Building, jungle animals on attack, ancient icebergs collapsing, volcanoes erupting. I can't recall a single amazing thing I've seen firsthand that I didn't immediately reference to a movie or TV show. A fucking commercial. You know, the awful sing-song of the blase. Seen it. I've literally seen it all. And the worst thing, the thing that makes me want to blow my brains out, is the second-hand experience is always better. The image is crisper, the view is keener, the camera angle and the soundtrack manipulate my emotions in a way reality can't anymore. I don't know that we are actually human at this point. Those of us who are like most of us who grew up with TV and movies and now the internet, if we are betrayed, we know the words to say. When a loved one dies, we know the words to say. If we want to play the stud or the smartass or the fool, we know the words to say. We are all working from the same dog-eared script. It's a very difficult era in which to be a person. Just a real, actual person instead of a collection of personality traits selected from an endless automat of characters. And if all of us are play acting, there can be no such thing as a soulmate because we don't have genuine souls. It had gotten to the point where it seemed like nothing matters because I'm not a real person and neither is anyone else. I would have done anything to feel real again.
I just want to put it on record that I have a soul.
But
That
you know that you don't.
that is a terrifying poem. I honestly feel sorry for this the author.
It's not a poem, it's a quote from the book Gone Girl. So it's basically this idea that every experience is part of. Well, she articulates it quite well. It's a second-hand experience, and it can't actually hold a candle to the uh, to the original article.
But also, I picked up that she had this idea that everyone had the same, like the exact same experience of human life, and I don't believe that's true. I believe she may have had the exact same experience as many other people because she's clearly addicted to social media, but I don't think the majority of people are there.
I think that a lot of people who have grown up with TV or even with, I mean, TV is just such a different experience than anything else because it's sort of constant and it's omnipresent, if that makes sense. It's different to the theater, which has like a sensuality, and it's different from um, radio or even books. There's something about sitting down and experiencing TV or
So you're saying society started to change when TV sets started becoming part of every house?
I think that once we started having easy access to recording ourselves, that's when we became performative as opposed to simply just engaged within a particular moment. But let me say this. I'll say that it also goes back further than that. Like, we go back to abstract representation, right? Like cave paintings, and you think about the people that made those, the abstraction or what they have created has outlived whatever it is that they were depicting, and by a long shot.
Something that occurred to me: can we actually be sure? Like, I haven't. My knowledge of older societies is probably limited, but is there any like evidence that people in like the past did like not share like a common like face to the world and a different face that they actually like did to their family? Like, was there
One
always that
face
this?
to the multitude and one face in private, are you saying?
I am saying like that's something that's existed since we like started civilization, where people had lived in such large groups that you can no longer just act to your own impulses and instincts. That you have to start like conforming to a unspoken law.
I think that, okay, so that comes into this idea of determinism, right? So determinism says that you have choices, but within a paradigm, so within a frame. So instead of saying that it's fatalism, which is, there is no choice, determinism is that there is limited choice and often it is made for you by the surrounding kind of factors. So, yes, people back then would have kept secrets. People back then would have lied. People back then would have cheated on each other. People back then would have stolen. They would have killed. We've got stories from the Bible, about Cain and Abel. This violence and this idea of secrecy and stories has been something that's been with us since the very beginning. But in terms of having a true, authentic self, I think that there's something now that is different because we share so much, an overabundance of input.
I do often find it like almost refreshing if I have the opportunity to travel overseas and see an actual different culture. It's almost like you're you're thinking how could my world be different if just everything was the same except for this culture was replacing where I lived. How it's opens up your eyes to how there's different ways of living.
So it's basically how your environment determines how you will live. And so, as a result of cars, people have become obese, let's say. But that's not you can't draw a causality. Like, obviously, yes, if you take your car everywhere to get milk or to get food, you'll become incredibly fat because you're living an incredibly sentient lifestyle.
Hmm.
And that's been enabled by the technology that has been provided to you. However, you do have a choice within that to walk if you want to. And so this technological determinism states that a society is as advanced as the technology that it's kind of cultivated.
Now that, oh, sorry, you go
No,
on.
no, go ahead.
I was gonna point out there's
So, for
sorry.
example, if you have a smartphone now, that has become a necessity of who we are. And if we look at those smartphones as tiny computers that live in our pockets and we treat them as knowledge machines, then we run into trouble because we do become lazy. We do become reliant on this new form of technology. And that's what technological determinism means, is that basically the technology that surrounds you determines to a certain extent the sociological conditions under which you live. So if Netflix and chill is a meme or a phrase, then you know that they've saturated the market correctly.
It also occurred to me that there's actually a biological change happening as well. The whole population is atrophied. You know that that has an effect on your hormones. Your hormones have an effect on your behavior. Everyone's behavior is biologically different than it would have been in a more physical society. And that's probably a driver of the big cultural differences you see even today between nations.
Well, you look at what self fulfillment drives towards, and it drives again towards this idea of sentience, this idea of navel gazing, of looking towards the inner self and the revolution of thought rather than looking at how to produce. Production has reached its zenith, and now it's just about consumption. And pure happiness for some is just purely consumption. It's not about, it's about the Promethean power of money rather than any sort of purchase.
There's a plot point in the series Star Trek where humanity reaches its utopia, and it's reached at the point where they've reached what they call a post-scarcity society. That's a concept they use in that series. But are we already in a post-scarcity society and we're just too greedy to like realize it?
Well, how many people own what percentage of wealth, and how much of that could be put forth towards actually curing poverty? In terms of like food distribution and wealth inequality, that's going to take a generation or two to fix because it's an educational gap as well. If people don't understand how to be self sustaining, then you've done them a great disservice.
Is this something that we've lost? Have humans in the past like not needed to be educated on like differences between wealth classes?
Well, the thing is this again, if you look at it, okay, so if you look at it as a metaphor, as a house, right? The Victorian house had all of the trappings, it had all of the symbology that declared what the society of the time actually valued. So the man sat at the head of the table, there was servants' quarters. The house was not only functional in terms of a space that you lived in, but it also moved to reify the class structure that was there already, right? So then with technology, but it also betrays a great fear of a scarcity mindset. So by being so kind of obscenely wealthy, it's a certain type of rich, a type of rich that you refer to quite often that I'm not going to refer to here because I think it'll lose us subscribers. But um, a racial rich, right?
No, it's not a racial rich. It's a rich that is it's a consumerist rich. Like the rich that it's how do you say? It's not about having enough for yourself. It's about shaming your fellow man. That kind of rich.
It's about, okay, so it's about being scared of the fact that there was scarcity before. And then along comes modernity, and modernity strips all of that down, and the house becomes purely a functional object, right? We don't need all of this sort of consumption. We're past that. We don't need this display because we are so assured in our continued prosperity and wealth. So we don't need to actually hoard or show it off. That's what comes next in terms of this house structure of modernity. So you go from Victorian to modern, and now we've got postmodern, which
Is that assured though? Is that the only direction we could go?
that is not assured. And the thing is this, is that land is becoming more and more centralized within a few central fiefdoms that are owned by, probably one of your retirement funds.
I had a topic came up in conversation today. The meaning of monopsony. Monopsony is where, like you all heard of monopoly, where one company has so much market power that it dominates the market. Like it doesn't have to be literally 100%, but it has 100% of the power. And like Apple recently has been accused of having a monopoly in the US cell phone market, meaning that it has so much power over, like essentially its network. This is what they would be alleging. Its network of relationships with its partner stores that sell phone plans is so strong that they're actually manipulating the prices, or they're keeping competition out unfairly. But a monopsony is where that power is held not by the supplier, the person making the product, but by the person buying it. And that happens in agriculture, particularly in this country, where, say, for example, farmers that grow sugar in Bundaberg, the price of sugar, which is negotiated between all the independent farmers of the region, many of them family owned, and a sugar corporation who then negotiates on behalf of the buyers of sugar in the market. But they always favor the interests of the industry rather than the interests of the farmers, even though they're supposed to be independent. This has happened over so many years, this essential corruption and bribery that goes on. It's just it's obvious. Like I'm not
It's
alleging.
become its own term, which is monopsony.
Yeah, so they've managed to keep the price so low that they're making farmers leave the land and change crops or just give up. And they're also discouraging their children from taking up farming, sorry. And what that is doing, what's in our future is that farmers will not pass on their farms to their children because they don't see it as a viable career anymore. And farmers will, en masse, but all individually, begin selling their farms to corporations, because who else will buy a farm when anyone who is, a family-sized entity doesn't have the economies of scale to make that farm work. So if you're selling it, the only person who can buy it, by definition, is a corporation. So it's inevitable. It's not like a matter of morals or questioning. This is happening.
Yeah, it is inevitable.
And the way it ties in is that eventually this will be flipped, because at the moment the power is with the buyer of the sugar, but in the future the enough of the farming will be owned by one entity that they'll be able to have the unfair terms. They will be able to say, we won't supply you any sugar until you give us a good price, and the power will flip. So it seems like initially that, things will come back into balance, but what is actually happening is things will come back into a balance, but at a level where individuals have no real wealth. and all the wealth is owned by mega corporations fighting over each other, the new nations, which is I think something you've brought up
Yeah.
before. Yeah.
But look, that's false normalization, I guess we could term it. But what you talk about there is interesting. In terms of Apple being a monopoly because of its system of relationships. So what is suggested in terms of this performative lifestyle, or people who are just performing their lives, is that they are the center of a system of worth or a system of value, and they are what makes it work. They are ultimately what makes it function. So by using a credit card, you are enabling Stripe technology to exist. So you're using PayPal. So there's a lot of kind of consequences or unseen consequences to the way that people live that determines not only how they perform their lives, but the parameters within which those lives can be performed. However, you are able to be a totalitarian in that you can decide to opt out of the system completely. So, when I say systems of value, I mean, for example, air fryers are a new craze, right? In order to cook an air fried meal, you have to have an air fryer. And there are certain meals now designed only to be cooked within an air fryer. So that technology has had a deterministic effect on the lives of quite a few people. So what I would say is people perform their lives to a much greater extent than they would have in the past, due to the fact that they know that any moment could be recorded for posterity.
So is there an irony in that technology, which is supposed to free you, is actually trapping you into very specific ways of living?
Well, if you're at the center of this system of value, right? If you're at the center of this network and you become worthless, then the network dies around you and you are left adrift
Uh,
personally.
And you can see this happening. This is the homeless population. They lose connections to,
To
well,
reality.
in some sad cases, yes.
Yeah. I would rather live in a fairy world than homeless. I actually can't think of anything worse than being homeless. However, what I will say is this is I did say about 20 minutes ago that I looked at performance artists first. All right? I like that quote by Gillian Flynn. I think it's self-explanatory. I think most of us understand. You know, you've seen kind of the perfect wedding, you've seen the perfect bar mitzvah, you've seen the perfect Christmas, you've seen the perfect Kwanzaa, whatever it is. And real life sometimes just can't measure up to that for people who are highly stimulated. However, going back to performance art, there's a guy called Wafa Bilal who set up an exhibit with a paintball gun, and this was during the time that the Iraq War was happening. He was an Iraqi refugee. He escaped Saddam's kind of repressive regime. This is before the first Gulf War, 1991. And he was now creating art in America. One of his projects was that he had an implant in the back of his head that would take photos every few, seconds. But that became infected, which was not good. But the other experiment that he had set up in a small room with a few web cameras and a paintball gun filled with paintball pellets that had a yellow paint in them, but also had fish oil, so they stank. And he started off the exhibition in a white room. It very quickly became yellow. He had a cooldown period programmed into the gun.
So
So
sorry.
that
Oh, you mean like the amount of paint that splattered on the walls made it yellow?
made it yellow, yeah. So basically what he'd done was he'd set himself up in a room where you could shoot him with this paintball gun using a control on the internet. You just pressed a button and it would shoot him. And also there was a live chat section as well that was archived.
This would hurt though. Like paintball's gun.
Oh
is
yeah,
not,
it would hurt. It would hurt, and it would also be unpredictable. So sometimes it would be while he was sleeping, he would suddenly get shot, or it wasn't like it just kept going. It was at intermittent intervals, and it was comment on drones and unmanned kind of projects around the world where weapons are being used against real people. Bilal, basically invited people to experience hyperreality. They were allowed to shoot him. They were allowed to insult him. They were allowed to basically do anything they wanted short of killing the man. And he had an air vent that would come up into the room to clear it of the scent of this fish oil. But because of the volume of liquid that was being created from the shots, the liquid started going into the air vents and damaging paintings beneath it. So he had to use a towel to block up the air vents. So his room became this stifling hot mess of just fish oil and paint. And he'd programmed in a cooldown period between shots. So say 8 seconds and then you can shoot again. On the 16th day, hackers got into the system and obliterated that. So he was just being barraged with bullets until the gun left out.
He kept up the performance. He didn't.
He kept up the performance. He didn't leave.
I've been trying to work out if I admire this man or I was trying to work out what I would do if I had the opportunity to
shoot him.
To like, as you say, do whatever you want. I honestly would just want to talk to him. I think he's remarkable.
Well, if you want an opportunity just to talk to someone, so there's something called Rhythm Zero, which was created by Marina Abramovich. And what she did was she placed a whole bunch of items on a table, and then she just said to the people in the audience, you can do whatever you want to me, which eventually led to a man almost shooting her through the head. He loaded a gun that was on the table and put it up to her neck with her own finger on it, and someone from the audience had to wrestle it out of his hands. People wrote on her, people cut her, people used rose thorns to push them into her skin. So this was a fairly wild kind of experience. And both of them have said that, well, at least Wafa Bilal has said what was said to him is what disturbs him most. The comments that were left on the message board were things like, oh, I'm having a tuna sandwich right now, or haha, sometimes I feel bad about this, but most of the time not really, and things like that. So it was the comments that actually rarely got to him, rather than the experience itself.
So they weren't particularly insulting, but more that they were just so, like...
Banal,
yeah. And that bothered him more than anything.
Yeah, really. And I mean, I can understand why. He was, living through an incredible suffering, and people are commenting on what they're having for their Sunday dinner. And I mean, he can actually see it in real time.
I think what he realized at that point and as I said before, I think he really is a remarkable man. I think that is when he first realized that he is different from most people.
In what way?
In the way that he clearly is someone who has like a childlike wonder for the world. He just wants to live. And yet people think it's funny to talk about their tuna sandwich instead of, appreciating that this is a piece of art that you'll never get to see again.
I think that childlike wonderment is kind of a hard one. I mean, if you want to look more into Wafa Bilal, he wrote a book called Shootin' Iraqi. But I would say that he is someone who seems very interested in the human condition. I'd say that him and Marina Abramovich are both people that are willing to put their lives at risk in order to prove something.
And maybe he came back wanting. He came back just disappointed in the human condition.
Well, I think that both of them have different kind of qualifiers when it comes to this, but I do think that both of them are severely disappointed with the way that they were treated, or the way that people were kind of blasé about the violence that was happening around them.
I think maybe it's somewhat of a realization when we're not that different from like the apes that came before us. It's still in us. It's just we've layered society on top of it.
Well, I think so. Then if you're talking about performing, I think that all of that is a performance in and of itself. When let loose from the constraints of society, we are more than willing to be barbarous or kind of savages. I do think that you look at a traffic jam and you wonder, these were people who just a few years ago would be clubbing each other over the head. Like a few years, I mean, in the great spectrum of time itself. But yeah, we've created a series of distractions that are starting to break down. And that's why society is starting to break down. Because people were distracted by their work. They were distracted by their jobs. Or rather, their jobs gave them purpose. And now they're used merely as a distraction tool to get people to pass from point A to point B. And I think that people do feel like they're performing a task that's perfunctory at work. So it's another level of performance that people have to enact.
But I feel like, I don't know, how many people are acutely aware of this and how many people are just part of the system? It's really hard to tell because you never know if the other person looking back at you has the mask on or not. It creeps me out.
I think that most people function by focusing on what's most important to them in any given moment, and that usually has to do with attaining some sort of pleasurable outcome. Whether that be at work or at home or,
I might have brought this up before, but I read a study recently that said that people with on the spectrum towards ADHD usually have traits where the opposite. They usually think into the future more than the present, and they estimate that the effect of this on society's pre-civilization would have been where like hunter-gatherers would be foraging, and the ADHD members of the tribe would be the first to sound the alarm and say we need to move, like we're running out of fish or we're running out of good weather. And by having a few of those in your gene pool, your tribe is much more likely to survive, and that's why it's become like a bigger and bigger portion of the natural distribution of what humans are today.
That and Ritalin and Pervitin and, Dexedrine and things like that are pretty cool.
This explains their existence at all. It doesn't explain the recent, like, massive increase since the invention of the television, basically.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's my point, is that at what point do you call something a performance and what is just nature, what comes as second nature and as intrinsic, and what part of that is performative? Because it doesn't come naturally to us to talk, let alone enact like a complicated ritual such as the abstraction around the price of a pear, for example.
Do you think society is going to keep like lowering the bar of what is acceptable behavior?
I don't think that we're lowering the bar of what's acceptable behavior. I think that most of us have turned inwards towards kind of this idea of attaining a totality within ourselves, which is impossible. You know, that's really what the dream is sold on, is the idea that one can become whole, or one can become merely a consumption object. You know, it's impossible. We need other people, and without that we don't form a totality. And so that's why when we look for the meaning of life, we can't find it if we're looking for it alone. It's mainly through religion or some other group practice that people are able to ascend.
I was just going to point out religion. I was reading a philosophy piece recently that suggested exactly that there's an innate need for many things in humans, and one of those things is meaning, and meaning really just can't come from a salaried job, and it used to come from religion, but as religious rates have plummeted, so too has like the
Well,
ability to find meaning in the world.
it's a Nietzschean concept of having to make all of these decisions for yourself. So instead of doing that, people fall back on these systems of value or these systems of worth. So it's like, are you a Reddit user or are you a Twitter user? Do you have Netflix? Do you have Amazon? Do you have Nikes or do you have Reeboks? It's not as kind of in your face consumerist as it was in the 90s, but there are still closed systems. Like Apple, for example, is a totally closed system by design. Steve Jobs knew that systems of worth were going to replace commodities as a whole. And if you think about it, these are technological products that are designed to break within a few years. So you have to upgrade them, which means that you're paying for a lot of things that you don't necessarily need, but are then a necessity because they have become part of everyday life. So they change your human functioning and your human behavior by virtue of existing.
Steve Jobs is admired in the business world, and I think this is something that a lot of people miss. Not because he was a great inventor, but because he understood what his company was. It was a brand. He's built a brand from the ground up methodically. If you think of the great brands of history, like Louis Vuitton, Gucci, these are like brands that have lived for 100 years or more. He's created something with that kind of prestige.
So imagine now that you've sold the idea that people can become brands, that you as a person can become a brand, that you can extend beyond yourself into the ether, that you can create atmosphere, as it were. So you can create a simulation of your life on Instagram. You can create a simulation of your life on Facebook. You can create a simulation of your life on YouTube. So just extend it that way and think about everyone being sold the idea that they are their own personal brand rather than being part of a system, an ecosystem.
If I can use the same example, Apple stores are always placed in the luxury good end of a mall. You think about where you find it. You don't find it next to the hi-fi store or the store that sells DVDs. It's next to the store that sells jewelry. That is a deliberate choice. It's a deliberate choice for them to buy the most expensive commercial real estate in a city and put a flagship store that loses money. And they lose money in every city that they're in because the rents are
The stores
exorbitant.
are basically an advertisement for the product. They're an advertisement for consumption. They're not meant to actually produce anything. They're only meant as temples to consumption.
Yes, and what they're doing is they're intentionally creating a culture. Like they're intentionally imposing an idea on upon
Yeah,
people.
the Genius Bar, the whole Apple kind of, there is this kind of idea around Mac users being their own sort of subculture of people, in the same way that, heavy Reddit users are their own subculture of people.
Do you think there are like other like companies doing the same? Is it something that all companies try to do? Or
I think that if you look at every company, if they could sell you air, the air that you breathe, that they would. That's pretty much the underlying motive of every company is profit incentive. And as I said to you last week, Henry Ford tried to change that and pay out some of that extra money, and his stockholders were not impressed. It's a byproduct of capitalism. And it's not necessarily that people are evil, it's that people are self-interested. So when you ask me, are people performing more? I would say yes. I would say since the camera has been invented and we can create moments for posterity, we have created the memories that we would like to see, rather than the memories that, we have naturally been birthed with or given. I also think that there's an imposition of imagery onto us. Like, I've seen a wealth of violence that I would have preferred never to have seen. However, and that goes back to your idea of what exactly the subconscious is. However, I do think that camera phones particularly have had a chilling effect on the way that people behave, because they are unwilling to take risks, and they're unwilling to ever appear in, bite-sized chunks where they may be foolish. I'm not, as a general rule.
something that I've picked up very recently, and I say recently as in particularly like after COVID, is that people online, and the majority of people online are probably young people, or younger people, people under 40, say, they when you get into an argument with one of them, which
Which never happens to you.
which never happens to me, happens to me often, I was going to say, and you're having it out on like comments over some like point that doesn't really mean anything.
Something on the Oz Bargain forums that has devolved into just pure racism. Yeah. Go on.
People these days, and no, that's a bad example because you can't do it there, but people will just delete their comments. If they feel like that they've lost the argument, they'll delete the entire comment chain and pretend it never happened.
Yeah, well, I mean, they feel like they can delete history. It's the same. Look, it's the Snapchat kind of idea of this is only temporary, but it isn't.
But like, it doesn't matter to anybody if the comments stay or go, because both of us walk away. We're not going to return. So exactly, they're just lying to themselves.
But that's a hug box. So, yes, are they performing? Are they keeping their social credit score up? Yes, but that's because for them, this kind of internet persona is an extension of self. And the mistakes that you make online will be brought back to you eventually if if you have made any.
It's a realization that even on like an anonymous social media forum, you're not anonymous. Like, people still act as if they've got no privacy everywhere now.
Well, no, yeah, that's the thing. People really do feel like at any moment they could be recorded, or any moment of their life could be taken out of context to ruin them. And that has had a chilling effect on society, and I do think that a lot of people are a lot less willing to take risks. And a lot of people do perform their lives, whether it's for themselves, for their families, for their business, or for an online audience where they can portray the best parts of themselves. But the short answer to your question is yes. If you disagree, please leave a comment and let us know why. Binkus, your concern for this week?
So my concern is that cigarette smokers are being lied to about the harms of e-cigarettes. So cigarette smokers are being given the impression that e-cigarettes are harmful, one, and two, about as harmful as cigarettes. And the problem is that it's not true. That means that there are many cigarette smokers who might want to pick up a vape, but are being discouraged because they think it's just as dangerous, instead of a pathway that might actually help someone eventually quit. It's like a natural progression. Like, it can be used either up or down. But this is being robbed from them.
Admittedly, I did use e-cigarettes when I was quitting smoking.
Well, that's exactly the point. If e-cigarettes weren't around, do you think you would have had as easy a time?
Probably not. I think that I also, apologies for that ear rape that was. I also think that I used them primarily because I was allowed to smoke inside of buildings with them. We still hadn't regulated that yet, so there was a bit of an overlap between me being a social miscreant and also the development of the vape.
And that's interesting. It's that this is really not uncommon at all. In fact, it's so common that it's alarmed regulators the world over. And almost like multiple countries at the moment are putting in laws that seek to either make vapes equivalent in regulation to cigarettes, or in some cases try and ban them altogether.
I know that there was a particular brand, wasn't it, Juul vape, that was banned by Biden. Biden took away everyone's Juul vapes.
Yes, that's a great example. Yep, and the only the argument was that it was so addictive that huge numbers of young people, particularly children, were now addicted to nicotine. Like, it was an endemic. And that they were like, their hands were tied. It was how severe the addiction was. Like, this is something
It was like Joe Camel had suddenly come back from the grave to hawk these addictive products to kids.
We read through the pages of history when, old London was full of drunks, 24 hours a day. And what we don't realize is that our society is not so different. Like, and that means the decadence and whatever you attribute to Victorian England, which I've never attributed good memories to that kind of era. Like, that is the era we live.
I hope that you don't have memories of that era. I have to be honest with you. If you do, I've got some questions to ask.
I have memories of many eras. That is one that I have that I have an association to. Another is like the colonial era of the what do you describe them as? The first pioneers. The US pioneers.
The founding fathers.
The founding fathers, yes, that kind of era.
You have a great affinity for these kind of like Vasco da Gama and people like that.
I just like the idea
explorer
of freedom.
Spirit.
Yeah, the idea of like your destiny is within your hands. Now, that is not what the talk today is about. The talk today is about what are they actually telling cigarette smokers? What are they saying is so bad about
what are they
vapes?
saying?
So they're saying that it causes popcorn lung. Now I'll describe to you what popcorn lung is. Now, I'm not sure how many of you have heard of this, but this is the message they're sending. So popcorn lung is a real disease. This is not and it's got an interesting name. So
really, does it? What? You don't say.
Let me make my point.
What's interesting about
Let
the
me
name
make my
popcorn lung?
point.
Okay,
I'm making
on.
my point. You're interrupting me.
Go on.
Yes. So it was discovered when workers who worked at a popcorn factory started getting sick. So if you've ever had microwave popcorn, there's a chemical called diacetyl. It's a food additive that has like a butter flavor, but it's actually just a pure chemical. It's like essence of butter. And they use this in microwave popcorn.
Why wouldn't they just use real butter?
Because real butter would go rancid in packaging. It wouldn't last. Processed food is bullshit. I hope people realize why processed food is bad for you. It's not food.
It's just chemicals.
Yes, this is what microwave popcorn is, or at least was. So what happened? This was in around 2004. Listen, I'm telling the story. So in around 2004, there was a spate of, and this is the first time, because I did a search for popcorn lung in Google Trends, and this is the first time the trend showed any activity, was June 2004. And it's during this period that a series of lawsuits made the news in the US and in Canada, but particularly one case in the US, where about 30 factory workers were all claiming to have lung disease as a result of working in this factory. And not all the cases were successful, but one couple got $20 million awarded by the court. So there was enough evidence for the court to award. There was a second that settled out of court. And then there were 4 employees who a different jury ruled in favor of the company, basically ruling that there wasn't enough evidence to prove that diacetyl caused this popcorn lung. So popcorn lung is... It's always...
What does popcorn lung actually do to you?
Popcorn lung is... It's scarring. It's... So imagine your lungs...
But is it in the shape of a popcorn? Like...
Well, it kind of does. So if you imagine your lungs... I can probably say, if you've never seen a picture of like what a mammal's lungs look like, they're essentially like a broccoli. So they start from a large opening, which for you would be, you know, your mouth. And then they filter into smaller and smaller capillaries, which fill with air. And the filling and the contracting of air is what your lungs are. They're essentially an upside down broccoli made out of like membrane. It's quite remarkable. So that's what your lungs are.
You said to me that my big opening would be my mouth. Would your big opening be located elsewhere?
No, my big opening would also be my mouth.
Okay, I just wanted to be clear because you said it as if maybe you wanted to tell me something.
No, I think your mind is
that.
just in the gutter, and we shall continue. So as I was saying before, diacetyl is a yellow liquid with this intense buttery flavor, and it's used as a flavor for both.
Do you like yellow liquids with intense buttery flavors?
It's also used for custards. That's what I was getting at. So it's not only butter. So it's used in like...
Then why isn't it called custard lung?
Because of the way your lungs look. When your lungs are full of...
But I thought it was because it was discovered in a popcorn factory.
No, it's not. That's what's so interesting about it. It has nothing to do with...
It has nothing to do with popcorn. It was just a coincidence.
Yes, exactly.
That's so weird.
So it's called popcorn because the damage it does to your lung looks like popcorn.
Okay.
It gained that name independently of it occurring in a popcorn factory. So it's quite remarkable.
It's like Lou Gehrig dying of Lou Gehrig's disease.
Kind of, yeah. But so it's not a poison though. It's a naturally occurring chemical produced by fruits and vegetables and many plants. And one of those plants is tobacco, which I'll come back to later. So, and it's also naturally produced during the fermentation of beer. It's got many natural sources. It's something that humans have been living around for forever. So that's not the issue. The issue isn't if you eat it. But if you breathe it in, it damages the lungs, especially if it's in high concentrations for a long time. But it's not the only not the only cause of this condition, popcorn lung, which has put people in hospital and killed people.
I still don't think you should name a disease something that stupid. Like, if it makes you laugh instinctively, like, you shouldn't name a disease that.
Well, I don't know if that's the official name. The official name is bronchiolitis because it's the small bronchi of your lungs that are affected. Obliterans, which means that they're obliterated. Like, that's the literal Latin name. That's the name of the condition. But it's commonly known as popcorn
that
lung.
sounds so much worse.
Exactly.
Call it that shit. Don't call it popcorn lung. That's like me calling AIDS ice cream sandwich.
I don't know. I think the visual of having your lungs dissolve into popcorn, like, if my lungs are actually doing that, I think that's a horrible visual. I think that's worse.
So if I called AIDS ice cream asshole, then you would still have the same reverence for it.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that it also has, like, you can interpret it as...
I just interpret it as someone opening their mouth and, like, popcorn spraying out like a Pez dispenser.
Well, that's what I mean.
And everyone, like, clapping and being celebrating like it's a fun thing.
No, that's exactly what I'm saying. Like, it's interesting that you imagine it that way, but I imagine it as your actual lungs are, like, deformed into the shape of popcorn. Like, I'm actually imagining something horrific while you're imagining something funny. Like,
does it get transformed into that or not?
Well, that's essentially what they look like. Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, like I'm remembering the images that I saw when I was researching this stupid topic. Because you haven't seen them, you're like, you haven't, you can't unsee. That is something that I hope people more and more would realize, and that was the point of my last talk, that you can't unsee things, and you should control what you look at because it does affect you. So now I always think, instead of thinking something funny about popcorn lung, I think of something.
That's why you immediately close your eyes when you see, like, naked men.
Naked anybody.
Yeah. Just going the straight asexual route.
So, as I was saying before, but it's not something you can just ban either, because popcorn lung isn't just caused by
Are you telling me you can't just ban a disease?
No, it's not caused just by one. Exactly, it's a disease. So it's also caused by irritation from ammonium chloride, which people use in cleaning, metal oxide fumes, which are a product of welding, hydrochloric acid, which bricklayers use to wash their bricks, and sulfur dioxide, which we're all breathing in when we breathe in car exhaust, particularly diesels produce sulfur dioxides. All these things have been linked to essentially a condition where, in the worst case, your lungs are completely, like, obliterated until they look like one of those anti-smoking ads. I'm sure.
Do you know that there's a theory that because we took the lead out of petrol, that's why we stopped having so many fucked up serial killers?
I've heard that theory, and I kind of believe it. Like, because lead's proven to have
like real people go insane from it. You know what I mean? And it has a real cause and effect where it coats certain parts of your blood.
The papers I read on it really put it quite blandly. Like, they would never be so callous about it and say it made people, like, nuts. They would say, oh, it would lower IQ points by, on average, 0.8.
Yeah.
In certain regions. And, like, they make it sound like it was just an occurrence that happened to have occurred instead of an entire generation of people being poisoned.
It's just this it's the presentation that always, well, as Wafa Bilal found, gets to you. It's the presentation, the way that these kind of obscene facts are presented as banal realities that were unavoidable consequences.
We allowed corporations to poison millions of people. It's just things that happen. Sorry.
Yeah. Whoops. Sorry, dog.
Anyway, so the point is that this condition, it's essentially it's lung disease, but it's not cancer. So it's arguably not even as bad as cancer, but it's still something that it's essentially a description of damage on a progressive scale.
I don't know. It sounds like something that I wouldn't want to have. I'll be honest.
And as I was saying before, yeah, there was a couple that won $20 million in a lawsuit. So that's essentially what that was the first time this kind of
hit the news cycle was 2014.
And that's when it became part of like the public consciousness that this thing existed, because this disease always existed, but it wasn't something that like the general public knew about. So this was the first spark where people have talked of memes as like something like a virus. They've talked about how memes spread through society the way a virus spreads through like an animal host, multiplying. Every time it meets one person, it multiplies twice, because the first meeting is two people, they're sharing a story. The second meeting, those two people are sharing a story. So already by the second meeting, the story has been shared 4 times. And it's something that grows exponentially. And that's the same way a virus grows. And so it's quite interesting that it's a biological rate. So, yeah, my point is that, yeah, it's very similar to how things spread naturally. So it is very something that is very much alive. I think it's worth thinking of it that way.
So look, I think that you're saying that the trend around popcorn lung became big because there was this settlement of $20 million. Now, was the settlement of $20 million from a popcorn company?
Yes, it was.
Okay, and so how did cigarette companies, I guess, use this fact that this had now entered the public consciousness?
Well, I think that this entering the consciousness of a small group of people led to the second instance. And this second instance was actually a study by the Harvard University School of Public Health. This was much later in 2016. And so that was the genesis of this idea that put that in someone's mind to think of this. And I just want to say like how that was how the story was presented. I did some more digging. And what they didn't say about what they don't say about the case when you look at like summary abstracts of legal cases, where they describe, the details. Because if you ever wanted to get like the full transcripts of a court case, yes, they're available. They're in a free country, but they're not free. You got to pay.
You have to pay per page, yeah, yes. And you have to pay an application fee, and you have to justify the reason that you want the actual documentation, things like that.
So what goes in the abstract is essentially the public record. It is the record, because no one's going to read any other version, and even if they do, there's such a minority that
they're statistically an aberration. It doesn't actually really matter. So what does this abstract say about popcorn lung? Does it say something about vapes causing popcorn lung?
Well, so what they missed in the abstracts is that the employees that actually could show that they got sick had been doing the job for 20 to 30 years. They had been exposed to this chemical for decades. And it wasn't even the employees who had been exposed for decades that were sick. It was only the ones that worked in factories that they'd proven during the court case that the ventilation was below even the standards that were at the time. So even if they were following normal standards of safety and ventilation, these people would not have got sick from the amount of exposure they had to diacetyl. So
basically it was the public has a false impression that this diacetyl causes these problems, but there was actually compounding issues such as lack of proper ventilation and also the length of exposure.
Exactly. So they've taken something that's
fairly specific to a very small group of people and expanded it outwards, or the breadth of it, to include a lot more issues, let us say.
So immediately after this, well, not immediately after this, probably 4 years after this, in 2009, this was after the idea of, actually, sorry. So a research study published by the Harvard University School of Public Health in early 2016. It was in December 2015. Was titled "E-cigarette flavoring chemicals linked to respiratory disease," and they published a study, and they specifically tested. They specifically focused on vapes that had flavorings in them. And the reason they did that is because in normal vape mixture, this chemical diacetyl isn't used. It would come up in like a search of, if someone was just trying to match random chemicals to conditions, and you were to do like, say, a database search, it would come up though in vapes that contained diacetyl, which were usually the ones that had this like butter or caramel
Flavoring.
Yeah, so that's where it comes in. So the flavoring contained this chemical that technically was associated with now a court case, but actually was quite harmless. So even though that's all they had, they ran with it, and they created this study. It was published by the Harvard University School of Public Health, and they didn't tell any lies. It's just they didn't represent any context, even in the abstract that they've put on their website, which you can read publicly. So again, if you want to read the full article, you have to download it. And that, even if they don't charge you for it, they know that most people on the front page will just read their abstract. And their abstract, again, doesn't present it in any more context even today, even though it's being misinterpreted.
Yeah, so look, it's linked to cancer, but only in incredibly specific circumstances, and only when a select group of people are presented.
And it's important to note that it was published by a public health school, not by a biology school or a chemistry school. It was published by a school that was doing sociological studies. Like, it wasn't interested in proving that the vapes chemically would cause or scientifically would cause disease. All it was saying was, we've published a public health warning because this link exists, and that is the standard we're applying because we're a public health. That's essentially, that's how I see they justify it.
They're playing it incredibly safe if that's their motivation behind it.
Now, keep in mind what that study was called, because I won't even have to read any more for you to understand what the study was essentially arguing. Yet, they argued in that study that it's only the vapes that had flavorings in them that caused this alarm, because one of the ingredients was diacetyl. However, there's two ingredients in all vapes, and if anyone who actually does vape would actually recognize these straight away. Glycerol and propylene glycol. They're the ingredients that when you vape them, they make the smoke. They're also the carrier of anything else you want to put into the vape, which is the nicotine, or if you want to put THC, whatever it is, it's the neutral chemical. It's very safe. It's food grade stuff, and this is something that people usually this is as far as they go, because it is true. It is food grade. However, it's food grade when eaten. When smoked, and a study has come out from, I believe it was from Japan, showing that the propylene glycol, when heated to the temperature that it would get to in a vape, 300 degrees plus, produces diacetyl. So everyone is already consuming like amounts of diacetyl, yet, and this is not something that shouldn't be, might be not obvious to you, the general public, but this should be obvious to a university. So why are they focusing on the ones with flavorings only? Like, they clearly don't understand the science that they're talking about, or they haven't done the research, or whatever interviews and field research they did was very minimal because they were only interested in publishing a headline. That's what I'm arguing.
So your frustration here is that they have deceived the public into thinking that vape smoking is much more dangerous than it actually is, and they've used this kind of flavored vape argument as just a front.
And I'll give you another piece. So the other piece that's not obvious to people, as something I said earlier, is that diacetyl is something produced naturally in fruits and some plants. the tobacco plant that's in cigarettes also has diacetyl in it, but not just about the same as a vape. It has between at least 100 times to 750 times more diacetyl in a packet of cigarettes than if you smoke a day's worth of vapes at the average use. More than, like, a minimum 100 times more. And yet, smokers have no cases of popcorn lung. Like, yes, they get cancer, but they don't get popcorn lung.
That's interesting.
So
it's clearly this set of conditions, and they are, and yes, I can see where your frustration lies.
Like, is it not obvious to a
diacetyl-
university that cigarettes also contain diacetyl? And if you're a public health school, then the alternative to vapes is not nothing. The alternative to vapes is cigarettes. Surely you would consider how vapes could improve the lives of people who are addicted to smoking, not only the harms it can do to people who are not smoking, and assume that people, or basically trap people into an addictive substance.
Well, talking about improving your lives and addictive substances, thank you for listening to this week's episode. I hope that it has entertained you. Maybe you had some microwave popcorn by your side.
Oh, I will add that they've now removed diacetyl from the microwave popcorn. However, the bags of microwave popcorn are full of BPA and estrogen disruptors. So when you put that in a microwave, make sure you set your microwave to like 100 degrees or so you don't, which you know is impossible. So you're breathing this stuff in all the time. Don't eat microwave popcorn. It's really bad for you.
Okay, well, there you have it. Until our next performance in this world full of mystery, you can entrust us to be your shepherds. Thank you very much for listening. Please leave comments, reviews, anything you like down below.